The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Roberts. I am from the Quality Assurance team here at City & Guilds. I'm here with Julian Wilder, who's the lead moderator for the Level 3 Technicals in Constructing the Built Environment, and Paul Monroe, the principal moderator. This is the Centre Standardisation webinar. We're still waiting for, I think, one other attendee, but we'll start and hopefully that person will be able to join us. So this is one of a series of webinars that we are running to support centres in the delivery of the synoptic assessments for our City & Guilds technicals. As I said, this is the Level 3 technical in constructing the built environment. The webinar will be recorded today and it will be placed on the website for you to access, and it will also be sent to all attendees so they can access it as well, along with any questions that are asked during the session. You will have been told that in support of this webinar, there is also a generic webinar on the website which talks more generally about the synoptic assessment and the marking grid, and gives some really good advice on how to use the marking grid, the structure of the synoptic assessment, and how to standardise markers and staff within the centre. So if you haven't already checked that out, then please do, because there's a lot of really useful, worthwhile hints and tips on that webinar. The materials to support this training session have been sent out with the invitations for the webinar. So if you haven't, hopefully you've all accessed those materials and had a good look through the learner materials. If you haven't, I would advise you to open those now and have them open throughout, because doing that you'll get the best benefit as the lead moderator runs through the justification of marks. If you have any technical problems, then please do not hesitate to contact the technical and moderation support team. So if you have a problem with the sound or anything with the webinar, you can contact them on 01924 206 719. There will be a period to ask questions, so we'll do that at the end of the session. But you will be able to type your questions in throughout the webinar itself. So on your control panel, there should be a question pane on the right-hand side. So please do feel free to type in any questions that you have about the synoptic and the marking grid as we move through the presentation. We'll also give you an opportunity at the end to ask any questions. We will try and answer everything we can in today's session. If we don't manage to get through all the questions, or if there's anything we can't answer, we'll come back to you after the session today. So, without further ado, I'll hand you over now to Julian, who will talk you through the objectives for today's session.
Hello, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. The objectives for the session are to explain the justification of the marks by the principal moderator for last year's synoptic assignment, and to highlight good practice in the use of City & Guilds documents. We're going to facilitate a standardisation activity and remind you of typical activities recommended for your own internal standardisation. And lastly, there will be an opportunity to have any questions answered. As Rachel said, due to the timescales, if we don't complete any of those questions, we can put them online later. Okay, first of all then, we're just going to look at the assignment itself. So what we're looking at there then is the context of the assignment. The brief there just gives the learners a little bit of context before they start to get into the questions themselves to understand the process, if you like.
It's worth underlining at this point, Julian, that these are a series of tasks from last year's synoptic assessment rather than this year. So please don't get confused about that. The synoptic materials from this year are on the website, but these are examples of tasks from last year.
That's right, yeah. But the documents that we move on to later on will be this year's, and including the newer documents. So if we go into the assignment, you can see that the tasks themselves are not prescriptive, and I think they offer the students a good chance to explore where they want to go themselves, and an opportunity to go off and do some wider research and provide a real depth of understanding in the work that they're doing. The tasks themselves should really cover the framework of things that were done in the teaching, so there shouldn't be any surprises in the direction that we go. It's more about the breadth and the level of understanding that learners show as they go through the work themselves. I think the key with the tasks as you look at them is that depending on where you come from in your teaching and assessment, we tend to look at a task and want to mark it on its own merit. And I'll probably repeat this several times as we go through, but it's really about taking a more holistic view of the work that the students provided as they're going through the work. And as I say, it's about really demonstrating a level of understanding as they go through. So what I've done is I've gone through the assignment. Hopefully you've gone through and had a go at marking this yourself. So as we go through, some of the bits will be familiar to you. And I'm going to pick out a few bits where I think the candidate, the learner, could have just increased the marks a little bit. So
let's move on to, so at the minute on the screen you'll see the marking grid, and this is the marking grid that's used to mark the synoptic assessment. This is the marking grid from this year, as Julian's already said, and we will look at that in more detail later on, but just to draw your attention to the fact that there are 5 assessment objectives this year you're marking against. The weighting for each assessment objective is on the left-hand side, and then there are generic band descriptors across 3 levels for each assessment objective.
okay, I'm sorry you didn't.
What you'll also see is that as well as the generic descriptors, which you can see here, on the marking grid, you'll also see some subject-specific descriptors which help you to fine-tune your marking. So it describes a learner's performance, so at the bottom of the band and the top of the band for each of the 3 bands. And that's the same across each of the 5 assessment objectives, as you can see. In some cases, you've also got a description across the middle of the band too. So moving on to the learner materials.
Okay, so we'll go back to the grid in a few minutes, but I think we'll understand the marking grid more when we've gone through a few worked examples. So the first example I've got is at the end of the first part of task 1, where it's talking about methods of joining steelwork together. And it talks about using different methods. So it's got end plate, it's got a haunch connection, it's got a fin plate. And I just think it would have been so easy to have included an annotated sketch here that A, would help to demonstrate the depth of understanding, but also when we come on to AO4, bringing it together, and AO5, the quality of the report, it would lend itself also to having that demonstration and making it quite clear to the moderator where the quality is and how it's been brought together. So there's a few more examples of a similar nature. So that the second one, if we look in the justification of specified method of cladding, and we look at the 3rd paragraph there, the top of the paragraph talks about, it says, in terms of thermal insulation, cladding is a great insulator. Well, for me, some claddings may be great insulators, others aren't. It's more about what the cavity creates and what we can do with the cavity. So it then goes on to say the structure's U value is improved, the overall thermal performance, and it goes on to state that by adding polyurethane insulation, it would improve the thermal value. And again, a listing of one thermal material, there could have been a list of 4 or 5 different materials used for insulating there. What would have been great to have seen was the student show a level of understanding of different materials. So if they did a little worked example of, say, a metre squared of the K value for a couple of different insulation materials, they could demonstrate that in that metre squared, this is how much of a saving could be made. And for me there, that just goes on to demonstrate an understanding, and not just somebody who's gone online and found the name of Kingspan or a couple of other different makes of insulation without really knowing why they was going to select one of those products over the other. So they could have gone into the advantages and disadvantages of different insulation materials and had a bit of an explanation as to why they wanted to use those. The next example then is if we're looking alternative methods of cladding, and it's the last paragraph in there where it says, furthermore, this method of cladding has a superior lifespan for the reason that it is an extremely rigid material and can withstand the harshest weather and extreme loads. What is more, precast concrete is fire resistant, thus meaning the structure is protected from random fires. In addition, it is by far one of the easiest cladding methods to install, saving you time, hence money. For me, that comment is a little bit throwaway. Just because it's saving you time doesn't necessarily mean that it's saving you money. And I think, again, that level of understanding, if there was a little bit of, say, comparison between something made in situ and something made in a factory and delivered to site, they could then demonstrate the time saving. But if you had the cost of the two methods of working, you might find that actually there isn't a cost saving. If there is, great, but certainly demonstrate that, and that is what would show the moderator that there's a level of understanding taking place in there. Another good example of that is in the section demolition risks and hazards. If we look at the bit there where it says at the bottom, furthermore, the risk of accidentally uncovering asbestos will also be apparent in the demolition of the existing buildings, as the buildings could contain asbestos and this may not be known. This would affect the workers and any public members within the area. Well, how would it affect them? What precautions would you take? And again, in demonstrating this level of understanding, they could have gone back to the control of asbestos regulations of 2012. That would have shown that they would know where to look for the information, and just giving a couple of examples of things that they would need to be aware of would demonstrate that there is a level of understanding. So again, a bit of a throwaway comment again without really going into a little bit more depth. A very similar example then, just where we're going to at the bottom of there on the section on demolition risks and hazards, and at the bottom there it says, lastly, the site conditions may harm you as constant exposure to noise and vibration could seriously damage your hearing. Well, for me, it's kind of, again, another bit of a throwaway comment. How much noise over how long would damage your hearing? So going back to the noise regulations, they could quote you in decibels what kind of reading you could have for a period of time without having certain levels of protection. And that again would show that they've done the research, they've gone into the work, and they're demonstrating that they've got the level of understanding. A similar thing with the vibration, so they could go back to the vibration at work regulations of 2005 and talk about the HABs. They could explain how long somebody could work with a piece of apparatus with a certain reading, and how that builds up over a period of time. So in a week you would be allowed to use certain equipment for X period of time. And those kind of understanding the readings, what things are measured in, and then using that in the risk assessment would really be a good way of demonstrating that there's a level of understanding. I think the other point we just picked up then was they just made a comment. It says the risk connected to services is also apparent in the demolition of buildings, as the worker may think about the live wires being disconnected, etc. But I just think, again, it's kind of a really surface level comment to have made, and perhaps they could have spoken about where would I go to get that information from the electric board, from the water board, what paperwork do I need to fill in for somebody to come and disconnect it, what kind of time periods would be involved in that. So Certainly if there's going to be a disruption to work activities and you've got people on site, but then you've forgotten to send a request in that's going to take 6 weeks to action, there could be serious implications regards the length of the project, completion dates, and things like that. Okay, so then on the next page we've got the risk assessment, and again on the surface it kind of makes sense, and we've picked up some obvious examples in there. I think what I would have liked to have seen was just a little bit of an explanation about the likelihood and severity, so that we could see what those numbers actually meant to somebody when we were working. But other than that, that's a reasonable example we've used there. And I think the last example, but very similar to the others there, on where we can show understanding, is the 5 documents used by the construction manager to coordinate a project. And it's talking about schedules, and it said the schedule allows the construction manager to coordinate the project effectively, as they're able to manage delivery times for materials and deadlines for the construction of the project. Without the schedule, the construction wouldn't effectively be able to commence, as delivery of materials may be too late or too early. Again, it's about just demonstrating the understanding of what that schedule is doing. So I think you could give examples of how you're going to measure the time. So you could talk about Gantt charts as well, critical path charts, how you measure staff, personnel coming onto site, what people you need at different times of the project. And you don't get the feeling from that one statement around how the paperwork is going to be used on site. So again, just a little bit more detail would give you more understanding. Which, as we go into the marking grid, we see is really the critical thing to pick up.
So what you can see on the screen now is one of the pieces of paper, one of the documents that we ask you to submit for the learners within the sample. There should be one of these for every learner at the centre. It's the Declaration of Authenticity. This is new this year. This form is new. There was a version of it for last year, but the new version of the form is on the website, so I do encourage you to check this out. There should be one for every learner, but we only need to see the Declaration of Authenticity for the learners whose evidence are submitted as part of the moderation sample. And what you can see on here is that you have the candidate details, and this is where the candidate confirms that the work that is being submitted is their own work, and then the tutor will confirm that. There's a box at the bottom which will ask you to highlight whether there's any additional support that's been given to that learner in the production of this work. For example, if you have had to step in as a marker, as a tutor, if they're going off track, or and you have to pay specific attention to what is permitted in the assessment pack. So please do check out the guidelines around support on what is permitted. And if additional support is given, then we'd expect the details to be put on that box there.
Okay, so the next thing we've got is the practical observation form. And in the task that we're given, there wasn't any practical work to have a look at. But this is a critical piece of evidence that the centre observer produces during the practical performance. If completed well, this can bring the performance to life. So, as you know, the moderator won't be present during the practical, so it's important that the document is used as descriptively as possible. Observers should describe how well the candidate performed against each of the assessment objectives, and the band descriptors should be used as a guide when when making the comment. Not copied word for word, but they will give you a good indicator as to the comments that you will be making in there. These forms can be handwritten or produced electronically. It's up to you, as long as the handwriting is legible, because you're going to be uploading these as part of the evidence with the rest of the work.
Again, just to say that this practical observation form, it was available last year, but it has changed slightly. So please do check out the website for these new versions of the form. And as Julian said, really important that you give as much detail as you can on the learner's performance in the practical within those boxes. that will help bring the learner's performance to life. Okay, so at this point, we move on to the candidate record form.
Yeah, so this is the candidate record form. This is a key piece of evidence, and it's new this year. The forms are supplied in the assessment pages on the website for each qualification. Take care to ensure that the marks along the top of each assessment specifically relate to the qualification that you're working on, as they may differ. I think you'll agree that the marks awarded to this with the marks awarded to this candidate, and I'd like to draw your attention to the way that the CRF has been completed. So, if we move on to.
Before we move on to the slide, just to draw your attention to the fact, you'll see here that, so this is the justification of marks that the principal moderator has given, or the marker is given at the centre. And again, AO3, the practical skill, is blank because within this learner exemplar there isn't a practical task. So the total marks of 34 there are actually out of a total of 54. Because there is no practical task in this particular exemplar. Moving on to the presentation.
Okay. So we're looking at the justifications now of the marking. So if we look on the comments that are made in blue at the bottom, I think when we was talking at lunchtime about the process of going through this, and Rachel used a really good term. So the first one was deciding which bucket we're going to put them in. And there's some examples, if you read across the band descriptors at the top, and then read through the comments in there, so you can see where it says the recall is accurate and covers a wide range. If we look in the descriptor, it says that we're looking for recall that is generally accurate and shows reasonable breadth. And I'm sure you'll agree that the work that we went through showed that the work was accurate. The terminology that was used was correct. There was some good construction processes discussed. And you kind of got the felt that the student, as they was going through that, had been on a course and learned something about construction. I think if you look at the band descriptor at the end there, where it says consistently strong evidence of accurate and confident recall, there would have been more understanding shown. So those examples that we went through where they could have shown more understanding, to move across into the third band descriptor, or the third bucket as we were calling it, there would have been a little bit more understanding. So that was how we come to end up in bucket 2. And then before, when we was looking at the content-specific boxes, that kind of helped us then when we was in, whether it was at the top of the band or the bottom of the band as we was going through.
So if we just have a little look back to remind you of that, I'll help you do in with this one. So just apologies that I will take you back to the right page. So we have the generic descriptors, which we've just shown you, and then we also have underneath them subject-specific ones.
Yeah, and they start to talk about quantities and the types of things that we would be looking for specifically to move through the band descriptors. So I think it was quite a good way of working, I think, to go through the ribbons across the top, the band descriptors, and decide which bucket was going to put somebody in. And then if we use the boxes at the bottom to look at either quantitatively or qualitatively the amount of work and what we was actually looking for, then that helped us to decide whether it was at the upper or the lower end of the band that we decided to put somebody in.
It's the fine-tuning, this part here, isn't it?
Fine-tuning was the words that just absolutely nailed it.
And just to draw your attention to the fact that for this particular AO, as Julian said, it was 8 marks that the learner achieved.
So on to AO2, which is understanding, and that was allocated 12 marks. We can see the evidence of the students' understanding. There are some coherent explanations. There's a good range of talk content displayed here, and that's a good indicator when making your judgment. Clearly, as we discussed earlier when we were looking at the assignment, there are many opportunities for the student to show a much higher level of understanding, it's always good to go back to the qualification handbook and remind yourself of what was taught. And again, if you kind of look through the examples in there, the band descriptor talks about showing comprehension, and in there we're saying that there was good terminology used. They had identified recommended processes, so that kind of ties in with the comment that was made. But then it says there may be a lack of depth or connection, and the comment at the end there does go on to say that no particular properties could be explored in greater depth. So it's indicating there that greater depth could have been used. I think if you look at again at the Band 3 descriptor, it says candidates use concepts and theories confidently in explaining decisions, taking and applying the new situation. So I think if we go back to our teacher training and think of Bloom's taxonomy, I don't think there were examples there where we were starting to apply things. So, it was very much about the recall. And I think that we'll see as we go through, particularly in AO4 and AO5, just how important the understanding is, that we get the depth of understanding and can demonstrate that as we go through the marking of the assignment. Okay. So, slide 6 then was a practical activity which is left blank. It does contain 10% of the marking, so that gives you a good guide to the importance of the practical skills. So we know in construction that small sketches, these people could be doing toolbox talks and things like that, so it's an important skill to learn. So when they're doing the drawings, make sure we get some quality in there and kind of use them in a way that really adds strength. And when we go into AO4 and AO5, where we're talking about excellence and bringing it all together, those sketches and practical things that we could be doing at AO3 really do help us bring everything together. Okay, so AO4, which is bringing everything together, has been awarded 8 marks. Each task was relevant, but further marks could have been awarded if they had shown more understanding. It's difficult to mark the bringing it all together when it isn't all there in the first place. So it's difficult to award a higher grade in AO4 and AO5 than that which has been awarded for AO2 understanding. So I think that gives you a good guide when you're going through AO4, AO5. If you've got a grasp of the level of understanding, it will kind of lead you in the right direction then for the bringing it together and the excellence at the end in AO5. And a couple of examples again then. We've got some, I haven't made the marks in there. Oh yeah. Okay, so if we look across the band descriptor, then it says show good application of theory to practice, and in there we've talked about practical applications with accurate and informative detail. So that's how we've ended up in the Band 2 descriptor. And I think when you read the comments in the Band 3 descriptor, again, strong evidence of thorough consideration of context isn't really achievable without demonstrating that level of understanding. And AO5 has been awarded 6 marks, again similar to AO4. There is some attention to detail. There's the comments that the students making are correct, good terminology shown, etc., etc. But the attention to detail, similar with AO4, it's difficult to award the top marks for attention to detail when, as discussed, when we looked at the assignment, the detail demonstrates that the understanding is lacking. So there isn't an attention to detail. I think the examples there, if we look in the band descriptors, at the top there it says, we're aiming for satisfactory results, but not persisting beyond that. And I think that was the feeling that you got from this student's work. And when you looked at the level 3 band descriptor where it says, attentive and persistently pursuing excellence, If you look at the points in the assignment where we could demonstrate deeper understanding, not only does it show that deeper understanding, it also shows that the student is pursuing that excellence. So the two kind of go hand in glove there, as we said. It's very difficult to award or get into a higher band descriptor for AO4 and AO5 than what was given at AO2.
Okay, so at this point, that kind of concludes the first part of the formal input. So I'm going to give you, we haven't had any questions yet, but I will give you 2 minutes now to type in any questions that you have on the synoptic assessment or the webinar that's being delivered. You can do that in the control pane on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll put the webinar on pause for 2 minutes, so please don't go anywhere. We're not going anywhere, but I will pause it and I'll come back to you in 2 minutes. Okay, there are not many participants on the line today. So, oh, we do have a question. I was about to say we didn't have a question, but we actually do. So it says here, can we have copies of the examples for last year that you gave to talk through samples with our students so they can avoid the same errors, please? Yeah, so we had a similar, Andrew, we had a similar question this morning. So what you've got, so you should have been provided with the exemplar that Julian's talked through this afternoon, so the exemplar of learner materials. You should have been provided with those already, and if you haven't accessed those on the invitation to the webinar, you will find them as a handout on this webinar. What I would say though, you need to use them with care because there's some really good advice on where the learners could have improved their performance, but actually this isn't an exemplar for learners to necessarily adhere to. It's one example of a learner's work, and how it's used really is an exemplar for you to standardise the markers within the centre. Because remember, this is holistic marking, and there's probably a wide range of student responses which are very different that actually could have the same or similar marks.
I think it doesn't directly answer your question, but the way to approach it, I think, is if you look at the principal moderator's report from last year,
yeah,
that will show you where the pitfalls are, and kind of as we've gone through the work today, hopefully you've got a better appreciation of where the higher grades can be achieved. And I think in your teaching, then it's taking people there. So when you're teaching these subjects, kind of say, don't just leave it at this point. Go into that depth. If you mention something, so noise is dangerous, then in your teaching sessions, which is what it's all about, giving you more opportunity to do that teaching, they can go and do that research and look at the noise regulations. And this, for me, was the beauty of the questions, having that freedom for learners to explore different things. So they're not all going to go away and write exactly the same thing. They've all got freedom to explore either something of interest to them or go down their own little avenue. But it's just about saying that, if I mention noise and say it's dangerous, that's something that you may mention in classroom, and it's just regurgitating what you've said. It's just increasing that amount of recall. If they want to show the level of understanding, it's, right, well, how do I demonstrate that I have that understanding of what I'm talking about? So I can go back to things like an HSE website, I can go back to regulations, and if I'm quoting them, and remember at the beginning we said that the research period is unlimited for students, so once they've seen the assignment, the tasks, they can go away and do the wider reading. They can spend as long as they want on the wider reading, and really that's where the higher level students will spend the time bringing that kind of information. So when they're doing the timed activities in the classroom, they've got the information at hand to be able to demonstrate that level of understanding. But I think it's going back to, in your teaching sessions, just keep imposing on them, this would be sufficient, but this would be good, and this is how you show a level of understanding.
And I through a number of the webinars that we've done, we've had similar questions to that, Andrew. And I would say that, again, going back to the marking grid and actually looking at what the descriptors say under each of those bands gives you a good picture of what the learner should be, the kind of learner performance to achieve that higher level band 3. One of the things that I think Julian wanted to flag was the concept of each band and what that actually means. That was raised in a question previously. So band 1, band 2, band 3 is not equivalent.
Yeah, they're not past merit and distinction marks. And again, I think, for some of us, if our background is marking in BTECs and having that descriptor to kind of go down that route, they really are a descriptor for you to really make sure that the marking is accurate as you're going through the marking.
That's a really important point to underline because, if you focus on making sure that the learner is in the right band, based on the description of the performance there and the finer tuning underneath, then that will help us to moderate.
I think another point that we discussed as well is a trap that we can fall into is knowing our learners. So we know a learner who attends regularly, they're very attentive, they ask questions, and we know the work that's gone into other assignments. So in this work, we then look into, oh yes, they're talking about that there, and that links to the work that we did last week. You know your students really well. The moderators, when they're picking up the work, it's very black and white, and that's why it's about making sure that what's written is marked and comes out clearly in your marking from the band descriptors. We know why you're saying that, because we don't know students, we don't know the other units that they've done, how well they've done, and the kind of student that they are in class. So we're marking in very much a black and white way.
It's all about basing a decision on the evidence for the synoptic assessment rather than how they performed in the course. Yeah. The one thing to underline what Julia said is we talked about band 1, band 2, band 3 not being equivalent to pass merit distinction. Actually, if you look at the descriptors in band 1 consistently, you'll see that hesitancy, inaccuracy, misunderstanding, guessing. So if you actually look at the descriptors, it's apparent that really isn't equivalent to a pass. And if your learner is systematically achieving marks in band 1, they may fail.
Yeah, I can maybe give an example of that. So from a piece of work last year where a student was asked to provide heating for a refurbishment project, and they were going to use heat source recovery with solar panels. Well, both provide a latent heat and probably require an additional primary source of heat, so gas or oil. And it just screamed at me that somebody's got these great ideas, and I know we all want to be green and kind of talk about the sustainability. And they've heard this stuff in the classroom, but then they've mentioned 2 different methods, which are both great methods, but perhaps without an holistic approach to designing a building, actually said, I don't understand what I'm talking about, I'm just recalling it.
Okay, so just to give you, before we move on, to give you the last opportunity, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in, just give you another couple of moments. And while we're waiting for those, just to remind you that the materials that you have and this webinar is part of a series of materials that you should be using within the centre to standardise anybody who's working on the delivery of the synoptic assessment. The kind of things that you'd need to do to make sure that everybody can mark to the same standard is looking at the content in the qualification handbook. It's really important that you familiarise yourselves with the marking and moderation guide because there's some really useful tips about how to use that marking grid effectively. You can do practice marking with your team using the student exemplar materials here. But whatever you choose, standardisation, internal standardisation is really a key activity that needs to take place within centres. And there's a series of different ideas there as to what you can do. Who needs to take part in that? Well, the tutors, the delivery staff, the assessors, observers, anybody really who's involved in the delivery and marking of the synoptic assessment to make sure that you're all aligned and working to the same level. Now, we haven't got any more questions at this point. Last chance, okay? So let me just bring in our principal moderators to see if Paul has got any additional points that he wants to make. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, I've just been unmuted. The one thing I would say that I don't think has been mentioned yet is that we finally have the marking grids, so they are a constant factor. The marking grid will now be the same in each qualification for the foreseeable future. So if you familiarise yourself with the marking grid for, say, the 540-hour qualification in construction and maintaining the built environment, you can work with the sureness that it will be the same in the next series and the series after and the series after. And that will help inform your teaching and learning strategies for how you deliver it. There are 9 different marking grids because there are 9 qualifications in 6720, but each one will be constant as we march into the future. The marking grid is key, and Julian's given some excellent examples of how you can do it. But if I was to say what's the headline news, the headline news is you've got to learn not to confuse a lot of recall with the beginnings of understanding. It's the understanding that will get your students merits and distinctions, and just hitting mark band 1, as Julian and Rachel have said, is not necessarily sufficient to get you a pass. So understanding is the key, and developing it a little bit further, as the words say in the marking grid. Otherwise, what you were told is how you will get good marks.
That's great, thank you, Paul. Okay, so I think there are no more questions coming in. Let me just check. So really just to move on to the final slide. So remember that there are a range of support and resources for you on the City and Guilds website tech back pages, and you'll be able to access those from the link in the slide deck that will be sent to you after this presentation. You can also contact the technical and moderation support team on the email address and the telephone number that's on that page. They are on hand to provide you with any support that you may need. I'll answer any questions on the delivery of the technicals. There's also the link there to this year's qualification report, which will give you some insight into the grades that were achieved last year, any sort of pitfalls or things that you need to think about in the delivery of the synoptic assessment is contained in that. It also contains last year's grade boundaries for this particular qualification. We need to highlight that the grade boundaries are subject to change annually following the awarding meeting. So even if those grade boundaries do give you a rough indication as to where the grade boundaries are, please, they are subject to change, so don't rely on them to be the same this year. But before we finish, we have another question in. So when we send you our samples, how will you communicate those names to us? I'm not sure I understand, Andrew. I'll try and interpret. I think the way that it works is that as soon as you have access to the moderation portal, which should be in March, and we will provide training for that, as soon as you've completed the synoptic assessment, you will be submitting all of your results and a sample of learners' work to that moderation portal. That has to be done by the 18th of May. Now, the sample is initially selected by the centre based on the information in the marking and moderation guide. So when you look at that guide, you will find the criteria for the sample. It basically depends on the size of the cohort, and we ask for a range of, I think it's more or less about 13 or 14 pieces of work across different markers and across a range of marks. That criteria is in that guide. So you follow that and you submit your sample to the moderation portal along with your marks for the complete cohort. Then following that, if the moderator wants to see additional pieces of work from different mark range or different markers, they will contact you subsequently after the 18th of May, and they will request you to upload in some cases, additional work. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes the moderator is happy with the sample that's submitted by the centre, but sometimes we do ask to see more work. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm just pausing to give Andrew. Yes, it does. Good. Okay, so I think that concludes the input today. So thank you to Julian and to Paul from the moderation team, and thanks to you for attending the webinar. We hope you found it useful. And just to say really best of luck with the delivery this year. Thank you.